How was your nap, Alex?
Amazing.
I like you're in the power nap zone. That was like a tight 25-minute nap, wasn't it?
Sometimes you just got to do it. You've got to set that alarm, put a podcast on, and just zone out. Sometimes I don't actually sleep at all, but it just gives me that time in a nice, quiet, dark room. And it's one of the luxuries of working from home. One of the big luxuries, actually.
But don't call it meditation. Don't call it that, because it's not meditation, it's napping, which I think that makes it socially acceptable. But I noticed there, it sounds like you got a bit of a regime, like you got like a process, a system, because you've got to get everything dark. You've got an alarm set, so that way you have peace of mind that you won't oversleep. And then it sounds like you've got a podcast, which means you're likely selecting podcasts that are complementary to napping. Is that true?
Selecting the right podcast is a very tricky business to fall asleep to. It's got to be interesting enough that it stops my hamster wheel, but not so interesting as that it keeps it going, Can
I ask you something? Honestly, you got to be honest with me. Are any of them my podcasts?
Over the years, TechSnap was a favorite of mine, although these days it's far too interesting. With Wes and Jim, I can't do TechSnap anymore. That's been taken away from me.
Oh, okay.
My go-to is ATP, actually.
Get John Siracusa talking about his cheese grater and take a nap.
Those guys talking about taking their iMacs to the beach. I'm like, get a laptop. What are you doing?
All right, okay. All right, let's not pull one of those. Let's talk about some serious fundamentals today. You don't get too far into self-hosting without figuring out the basics of dynamic DNS typically, and definitely reverse proxy. Do you agree?
I certainly do. My ISP gives me an IP address that changes almost weekly, and ain't no one got time to remember those numbers.
And there are so many ways to make life easier, like at a software level. Even with my fairly expensive, fancy Comcast business connection, we have a dynamic IP that changes fairly often, or at least more often than I would expect. So you got to solve that problem if you want remote access. And then if you want to dive into the world of VMs, containers, or really even just load balancing and proper security, you have to sort out reverse proxying. So what do you think, Alex, about bringing in Mr. Wes Payne for this episode to chat about some of these topics? Because he's the one that's implemented some of this in production here at the network.
I think that would be an excellent idea. Are you there, Wes?
Hello, guys.
Hello, Wes. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to sort out dynamic DNS and reverse proxy basics today. And maybe we start with the core issue is ISPs give you a public IP address, but that IP address changes every now and then, and it sort of varies from ISP to ISP on how often that changes.
I run a few boxes for my family. My mum's got one in the north of England. My dad has one in the south. I have one here in Raleigh. And I needed a way to connect to all of these different places when these IP addresses change. And for me, that involves a few different things because each of my parents have different broadband providers. One of them's running Synology NAS, the other one's running a proper Linux box, and I'm running pfSense. And I need a way to try and get all of these things talking together. So there's a couple of services you can use. DuckDNS is one example of that. And what DuckDNS does is you run a client on your LAN. So that could be DD client, or it could be something built into your firewall, such as pfSense. Often has clients for this too. And that takes your WAN IP address. So this is the public IP address. If you go to something like ipchicken.com, and you'll get your public IP address.
I use ipchicken too. That's amazing.
That chicken is so funny.
Did you get that from Dignation? Be honest now.
I actually got it. This is going back a long time. When I was working in a hotel as an IT manager, we had some consultants come in and they used it, and I thought the chicken was hilarious when I was 19. And that's
ipchicken, baby. Anyways, not to interrupt, but I just wanted to celebrate that moment.
So yeah, what I do is I have this client running on my LAN. It scrapes my public WAN and then updates a DNS record with my DNS provider. I used Namecheap for a long time. I've recently just switched to Cloudflare. I don't really have any preference as to which is better, but Cloudflare had a nicer two-factor authentication setup, so I felt like it was more secure. Don't know if that's true or not, but
we're using a Python project that has a bunch of DNS provider support that is maybe useful, because I use that to roll our own dynamic DNS
So once I have this client running on my LAN and updating Cloudflare, what that enables me to do is instead of typing in the IP address, I can now type in a domain name. Now, a while ago, I bought my own domain name, which is, like google.com or something like that.
Really? You got google.com?
Wow.
Yeah, it was free. Funny that. I couldn't believe it. So I have a bunch of different subdomains that I use. For each family member, I denote them a couple of characters, and then I use that as the kind of naming convention for each person's house. Rather than using subdomains per service, which is quite common, such as, plex.domain or bitwarden.domain or whatever it might be, I tend to go for, location.domain.tld/service. So I'm using subfolders instead of subdomains. Personal preference, you do whatever you like. But for me, that logical grouping makes more sense. What do you do, Wes?
Well, actually, we've kind of just switched over here at JB. Now we're mostly doing subdomains. And part of that may have something to do with the tooling we're using. But, really, it doesn't matter unless you have a particularly picky backend app.
I kind of want to go into that a little bit. Let's unpack that, as they say. So why did we switch to subdomains?
Well, part of it is, we like to use Cockpit around here, or at least, hey, you certainly do, Chris.
I think it's neat.
It is neat. Unfortunately, they've already reserved /cockpit as a URL they use internally.
Well, you could have done /cock, but maybe that wouldn't be.
Yeah, I thought about that. We do have many humorous domain names and URLs here, but I thought just cockpit.domain made the most sense.
Yeah, it's very consistent, too.
Mostly I didn't want to have to remind you down the road of how to get to it.
Well, that consistency helps everybody remember.
So here's where this gets a bit interesting for me, right? I have a few services which I break my convention for. Nextcloud is one. Another one is my VPN. I have different subdomains for each VPN, even though they end up resolving often to the same IP address. It's weird how I can't. Now I think about it and I'm talking about it, I realize I break my own rules.
Why do you suppose that is? Is there a distinction? Are you breaking out some sort of rules or security or user base? Why have you broken it out like that?
I don't have a good answer.
Just over time?
I guess I feel like it's more established if it's got its own subdomain versus piggybacking off my house's or locations subdomain with a subfolder.
I kind of get that.
And that is often, right? I mean, if you have a subdomain, depending on your setup, you may need to do additional configuration to create the subdomain. And with a path-based URL, well, that's just at the, the load balancer or reverse proxy level. So you can just naturally add it to the config.
Now that Alex says that, though, I think that's my line, too. A real legitimate service, it deserves its own subdomain, and an adjunct functionality gets like a / thing on an existing domain. And that's generally how I break it down, which makes me think we should probably break CodeAMD out to like a markdown dot whatever.
I think you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Because having a port number in a URL is so 2000.
Yeah, that's one of those. We tried something really quick. And
that was, I remember saying it when I spun it up. Well, let's give this a shot. We'll host our own just to throw things at it. And
3 months later, we're using it daily.
As it happens.
Linux Server happens to make a CodeAMD Docker, by the way.
Oh,
great.
Really?
Don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know that. Did you know that? Is that what we're
I think
using?
we're just using the main upstream one at the moment.
Oh, jeez. Should have just checked. Should always just check. You should always check to see if there's a Linux Server IO image.
Yeah, we have a handy dandy image search thing at fleet.linuxserver.io, fleet of container images. Anyway,
Nice.
Written by one of the guys on the team from Devon. It's super useful tool.
So you mentioned port numbers. I think the other aspect of this, just before we get to reverse proxy, is we should quickly cover port forwarding basics, because that's a big part of this too.
Well, and before we get to that even, I'd like to know how you update your dynamic DNS. I use DD Client and pfSense. How do you do yours?
Personally, I've used a few things. At home, I think I'm using Hurricane Electric's DNS service, and they've got just a nice little API endpoint, so I have a script written with curl. Here at the studio, well, we're using Hover, and they didn't have an easy solution built in. Thankfully, there's a nice project called Lexicon, which is a Python library that has interfaces to a whole bunch of different DNS providers, so you can script something together real quick.
This thing is so cool, Alex. So this Python library has gone to all of the trouble of figuring out how to essentially interact with the web UIs of all of these different registrars and then you just provide it the information and it manages that. So it's really kind of, in a way, low tech, but so beautiful. We use it here seamlessly.
Right. And, it's it has a nice API right from the command line. So you don't have to be a Python developer or anything. I just wrote a bash script, and I prefer icanhasip.com personally. Guys.
No chicken,
use whatever you like. And then you just, delete the old record, add the new record, and you're done.
A super useful tip from the command line is curl ifconfig.co, and that will get you a public IP address as well.
Oh, okay. That's nice. That is quick. We'll put a link to the Python project in the show notes because it's so handy. We run it here on a local server, and when things change, it does all of the legwork to log into Hover and update our IP address. Also, tangentially, Hover, please create an API. That would be wonderful.
No kidding.
We love you a lot, but you really need an API. This is 2019 now. It's almost 2020, really, which is kind of freaky.
And for anybody listening in the UK, they're using Hover, not Hover, because it took me a little while to work out that that's what you were saying.
Don't you mean H-Hover?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Joe is triggered right now.
So a little bit of port forwarding basics. Port forwarding, boy, how to really describe this isn't something we can walk you through because it's quite literally different for every particular vendor and even their different iterations of hardware components.
So I have a fun story about how I got into port forwarding. I was 17 and I was at sixth form college in Winchester in England.
I love this already.
I wanted to access my computer at home from college because my computer at home didn't have any internet filters on. So I was using the RDP protocol and I exposed RDP to the internet, which, what year was this? 2004, 5? I didn't know any better.
No, you're talking to a guy who just hooked a modem up to one of the school computers and just had at it.
It was a different time.
Yeah.
I learned how to forward ports that way. So port forwarding's pretty simple to understand. You have a service running on your computer at home, which is behind a firewall. You want to be able to access that running service from outside your firewall. So all you're doing with a port forward is telling your firewall when it receives a request on port 3389 for remote desktop, for example, send it to this internal IP address on my network. So it goes from your public IP address, hits the firewall goes, what should I do with this? Does it match any of my rules? Yes, it matches this one. I'm going to send it to 192.168.1.2 or whatever it is. And then your system on your LAN will receive that request and you should be able to connect to what's happening.
Very well said. And an analogy could be you call into a phone system from a public phone number and then you get routed to an internal phone. And the router maintains a list of MAC addresses and requests and where things came from and where they're going. And it does that sort of middleman work. And it's very transparent and it's very fast. And it's the basics that you have to go through to get access to something that's on your LAN from the internet. And each different machine or configuration will be slightly different. Alex and I are both really big fans of pfSense, and we'll probably talk about that in a future episode, just dedicated, because it's so great. But once you understand those basics, you understand why you have to bother with your router. You need to get your login. You need to make sure it stays up to date. You got to make sure this thing's protected, and you have to learn how to do port forwarding.
But it does mean then that if you get excited about some random project and just spin it up on your laptop, well, not just anyone can access it right away.
There is an argument to be had which says you shouldn't open any ports whatsoever, though.
I agree. You could totally make that argument. You could put it all behind a VPN. We kind of do like a bit of both. Well, some services that we feel maybe just based on our own sort of gut instinct, we'll feel maybe they're more robust, they're more commonly public. We might turn those on, like a Nextcloud.
Right, that is a prime example.
But something that is maybe not as publicly facing often, like a Usenet downloader or something like that, you might not publicly expose.
Really probably just don't expose unless you have to. Nextcloud's a case of we have a variety of users, not all of whom need more direct access to our system. So that's kind of an outlier, but basically everything else is behind some sort of more controlled access.
Do you think you could argue, Alex, that even in the case of that kind of stuff, it's always worth just using a VPN or something?
I think it depends entirely on your risk profile. I tend to fall somewhere in the pragmatism side of risk, which is I'll open port 80 and port 443 and 32400 so that I can get Plex working. Those are the 3 ports that are almost always open in my firewalls. I guess 22 must be open as well for SSH.
I almost always eventually open up SSH. It might take me a little while. Like, I'll wait till I really have to do it, and then something comes along, and I'm like, okay, fine.
Yeah, I run SSH on a different port from 22, but then I use the port forwarding rules to convert it to 22 for the local system. So that's a nice thing you can do with port forwarding as well.
WireGuard, for me, sort of changes it a bit because it's so quick to fire up a WireGuard interface.
I've had the problem where I've got a WireGuard set up into the studio and I'll leave it on sometimes. And because it just immediately reestablishes, suddenly I'm routing it out through the universe for no reason.
On my Fedora box, it's broken right now. I tried to mod probe the WireGuard module and I just got like some sort of like kernel module mismatch error.
That's why we need it upstreamed already.
I know. It's so great. If you've heard a lot of hype about it, the great thing is from a user perspective, it's as quick and easy as just turning on a network interface and turning off a network interface. And that's so sweet because all of my different networks have a slightly different IP scheme. So I can just turn it on and then I get to all of the different stuff by going to their IPs and on different subnets. And it works so great that I literally forget sometimes to turn it off. And I'm like, oh yeah, I should probably just turn that off now, like a day later. And it like resumes between sleep. And you even found out you moved from your place downtown. It came up to the studio and WireGuard reconnected.
It just boom.
But that's a total like IP change, like LAN IP.
I was on that network and it was still routed through WireGuard.
The experience is reminiscent of Mosh, if you've ever used that for SSH.
Yes, Mosh is also really great. Anyways, that's port forwarding in its basics. We'll have a little bit more info and some of the things we just talked about in the show notes.
The thing is, right, so even if you do use a VPN, this is going to be a bit of a sales pitch for reverse proxies. Even if you are using a VPN, I still don't want to remember port numbers. Running a service :port, for example, is just, I can't be doing with it.
Okay, so reverse proxies. This is solving a big problem. What's a great way to explain to people that don't understand what reverse proxy is, what it is?
The reverse proxy is one of those projects that you put off for years, and then when you finally get to doing it, you realize actually it was pretty simple all along.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think when most people think about reverse proxy, they probably think of Nginx. That's always been my experience. However, recently, more and more people are using Traffic in production. I don't know how you're supposed to say it.
Well, they say Traffic.
Do they?
Uh-huh. Right in the docs it says Traffic.
Oh, well, good. Then that's great.
A reverse proxy in and of itself it's just a web server, generally speaking from the internet, but not always. In its simplest form, you make a web request on port 443. You've created a port forwarding rule to forward all port 443 requests to the IP address of the system running the reverse proxy. The reverse proxy then has a bunch of rules in it which tell the web server what to do when it receives a certain request. So, each web request looks different. It could have a cookie in it. It could have certain headers set. It could be at a certain URL. There's a whole bunch of clever rules that you can set in reverse proxies so that you only have to expose one box to the internet.
This is also a really straightforward way for load balancing to work.
Yep. If you are familiar with, ELBs in AWS, for example, a lot of that technology is just using stuff like HA proxy and Nginx under the hood anyway.
Yeah, they repackage it. So that's why it's really good to understand those fundamentals.
Well, and a lot of these, software techniques have evolved and basically stolen jobs from what previously were hard pieces of hardware sitting in a rack.
Very expensive pieces of hardware, too, as a matter of fact. Very, very expensive pieces of hardware with yearly support contracts and whatnot. So, yeah, really, when you look at it in that regard, the cloud versions of these are not that cost prohibitive.
It also means you can kind of, have another layer of abstraction. So instead of having to worry about how you configure, how you get to all these different apps within each app, which might have a different configuration format, you can sort of centralize that at your reverse proxy.
Yeah. And we really use it, and most people use it in a very straightforward way to just connect the outside world with applications that are running inside containers that don't have public IP addresses. And that's probably one of the most common use cases for reverse proxy today, and probably one of the more common use cases for our audience, I would imagine.
Yeah, a super cool thing you can do with Docker actually is you have a Nginx running in a container. You don't want to open any more ports on a local container, then you absolutely have to. You don't want to map any more volumes you don't want to give that container any more permissions than it absolutely needs to run. And so the really nice thing using the Docker networking is you can reference other containers just using the container name as a DNS entry. And because the Docker network doesn't require ports to be opened, it has permission to see inside and do everything it needs to do. And all of this happens transparently to the end user. So you can just hit a URL, which is service.domain.tld/service. And it's as if you went to 192.168 IP address, port. It's exactly you will receive exactly the same content as if you did that transparently.
I think before we go too far into this too, I want to make sure we're not losing anybody. If I was coming into this right now, I might think that maybe there's like a reverse proxy D or something that you use. We should be clear that this is a functionality that several different software projects provide, including the classic Nginx. But there's others like Traffic, who I mentioned earlier, and you've put that in production in a couple of different places for us. Why did you choose that over Nginx? Because I want to make it clear to the audience that there are multiple ways to solve this problem, like so many things in open source. There's several options available, and you picked this one.
Yeah, I mean, you could use Apache, you can use other, more modern options that exist. One thing that kind of sold me about Traffic, well, for starters, I just wanted to play with it. I was curious. We had some new deployments. I thought, well, none of these are super critical at the moment. We can afford to evaluate some new technology here. And Traffic just plays very well with things that are running in containers. And I wanted a system that would allow me to still define some sort of, some static endpoints that I knew that were running, for instance, Cockpit, but being able to have stuff not in containers, not automatically be configured. But for the rest, with Traffic, the model is you just add some labels on your images, which are just some annotations that go on there with extra metadata. And you tell Traffic, like, yes, enable this. Here's the port that you should grab. And you can configure, like, do you want this to be a subdomain or a path-based route, depending on what you want. And then Traffic is listening, talking to Docker or Kubernetes or a bunch of other platforms, pulls that information in, and then dynamically adds that new service for you.
Neat. Does that break if I change the name of a container?
I mean, as long as you keep all the labels matched up, no.
That is so
So you
cool.
can just tear it down, spin it up. And there's tons of other stuff that does this. I just thought, though, that's a nice functionality, and it worked very well for our particular use case.
That is really nice.
The only thing that I don't like about Traffic is it mounts the Docker socket.
Yes, it does, indeed. You can do so read-only, but it still needs access to go pull from stuff, yeah.
Right, it's got to get that info.
Exactly.
It needs that data. So there's some security risk there.
But because it does that, it has a few neat tricks up its sleeve. So it can automatically watch for new containers stopping and starting. It can automatically figure out how to route different requests just based on those labels. And you don't even have to restart it, which is one of my bigger complaints with using Nginx as a reverse proxy.
I also like that it has just like modern functionality. So HTTP 2 is supported right out of the box, and WebSockets, which Cockpit uses. You don't have to do anything special or have to account for it. It just works.
So Wes, seeing as I have a traffic guru on the line, I wondered so a lot of this works and scales really well when it's just one box on my LAN. If I wanted to expand things a little bit and have, a NUC running Nextcloud and another NUC, say, running Home Assistant and something else running Plex somewhere else, can I have traffic running on a different instance that doesn't have access to the Docker socket and still have all of this stuff work well?
Now, you would need another way to go get all the information. It has support for a lot of providers. I don't know that would work. You could manually define all the routes, of course. You just need a bridge that would let it pull that information out of Docker somehow, I guess.
What's the story with Traffic's web UI?
The web UI is handy. I mean, I don't know that you would leave it running in production necessarily, or maybe just internally. I found it very useful as I was learning how to configure Traffic and get started using it, because it just pops up. You can enable it, go visit it, helps you troubleshoot, and shows you nice, because they've got an idea of entry points and sort of front ends, which are, like a logical entry that sort of defines your service, and then back ends behind it, which you might like load balance across or do something there. So it can make it clear like which pieces it's seen. You might have problems with it, actually getting the right access to Docker at first or something, and it'll be clear in the web UI.
Oh, yeah, I could see that being very useful for starting up. Also, it has an API to integrate with Kubernetes and other orchestrations, so that's kind of...
Yeah, it'll play with Amazon ECS as well. You can plug it into stuff like etcd or Zookeeper. So if you were using one of those systems, then it'll work.
Seems like Kubernetes is the blockchain of this space, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe so. Yeah, although really with some, real nice advantages where blockchain is sort of like still people are sorting that out. Kubernetes is actually getting deployed.
and Traffic may be, a tool that you could help if you were sort of doing some stuff in Docker and starting to play with Kubernetes. It might be a technology you could use to bridge the gap.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see a lot of stuff with HA Proxy because OpenShift ships with HA Proxy, but yeah, I'll be interested. Maybe I should try Traffic out with a local Kubernetes cluster. But anyway, we were talking about different reasons as to why people wanted to use reverse proxies. I mean, for me, the biggest one is no more port numbers. And we haven't really touched on the security benefits yet. And for me, one of the most important ones is that any proxy I'm using should have a way of doing automated TLS stuff using Let's Encrypt. Does Traffic do that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's built right in. It can store it in some fancy backends if you want. Otherwise, it defaults to a JSON file. This has advantages and disadvantages. It's not kind of the normal format you're used to. So if you need to grab that cert out of there and use it for another application, then you probably have to use a script to pull it out. But it is just a JSON file, so that's pretty easy.
Let's Encrypt has really changed the internet. It was something which you really, you used to have to pay real money for, and now I can just SSL all the things. It's great.
It is really great.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about Traffic in particular was how easy that was. I mean, it's 4 lines in my config file, and most of that's just like, do you want to use HTTPS, and what's your email?
For those of you who are of the Nginx persuasion, the Linux server team make and maintain an Nginx Let's Encrypt, we call it Let's Encrypt image, which has baked in support for automated Let's Encrypt certificates. And it runs a cron job every night, so it will automatically renew the certificates for you. And it just handles everything that you need, and you just configure it using environment variables.
That's great.
That is great.
That is really a nice way to get started. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes.
And coming up in a future episode, we're going to talk a lot more about containers and Docker and try and break down some of the mythology around that sort of stuff. Try and give you some tips and tricks that we've learned over the years, stuff like Docker Compose maybe. And Chris loves a GUI.
Hey now, I haven't used a GUI in a while, but you're right. We'll talk a little bit about that as well as what the fundamentals are, what the difference between a Docker container is and a container. So that'll be in a future extras. Plus, in the main self-hosted show, in the regular self-hosted show, we'll be discussing how we use this stuff in our day-to-day lives more, as not just what we covered today, but also as it evolves. Because I think there'll be more containers we're deploying as the future goes on, Alex. It seems to be. I've always got more.
And you just bought a Pi 4, right?
I bought 2 accidentally.
We're going to be all about trying to do stuff that's affordable as well. One of the things in that chat with Wendell that we had was that was looking at massive servers, right, with big budgets and not enterprise, but it was more enterprise level stuff than
business level.
Yeah, small business, that sort of thing, right? And what we're going to try and do with the Pi stuff is bring it back down to earth a little bit, give people something that, is not going to cost you $1,000 as an entry price,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, do check out Self-Hosted episode 3.
You can find me on Twitter at Ironic Badger.
And I'm at Chris LAS, and get more extras. Extras.show/subscribe.